It is an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Somewhere in the American Midwest, a woman is hanging laundry in her backyard, moving through the familiar geometry of clothespins and damp fabric, squinting slightly against the yellow warmth on her face. A few streets over, a group of teenagers are lounging in a park, faces tilted toward the sky with the particular shameless luxury that only summer allows. On a beach in Portugal, a man is reading a novel he has been meaning to get to for 3 years. In a paddy field in Vietnam, a farmer adjusts the brim of his hat. In Norway, a fisherman is checking the weather. In Peru, a child is chasing a soccer ball across dry red dirt. None of them know it, but every single one of them is experiencing the last genuinely ordinary moment that will ever exist. Because at precisely this second, somewhere around 93 million miles away, embedded in the centre of the thing that makes all of this possible, the unthinkable has happened. The sun is gone. Not dimming, not fading, not going through any of the spectacular phases that stellar physics predicts for a star in its twilight. No swelling into a bloated red giant, no gradual brightening that bleaches the oceans over millions of years. Just gone. Vanished. Removed from existence as completely and suddenly as if some cosmic hand reached out and switched it off like a light. In an event that has no precedent, no physical explanation, no mechanism that current science can describe, the sun, all 333,000 Earth masses of it, all 1.3 million Earths packed into that flaming sphere cells simply ceases to be. But here is the thing, nobody on Earth knows yet, and they won't for exactly 8 minutes and 20 seconds. This is not a flaw in human perception or a failure of technology. This is physics itself, the fundamental architecture of the universe imposing its rules on the situation. Light travels at approximately 299,792 kilometers per second, and the distance between the Earth and the Sun averages about 150 million kilometers. Do the maths, and you get a travel time of just over 500 seconds, 8 minutes and 20 seconds, which means that the photons currently caressing that woman's face in the Midwest, the ones warming the teenagers in the park and glinting off the surface of the novel in Portugal, left the sun more than 8 minutes ago. They are the last photons, the final delivery from a source that no longer exists, and they are completing their journey in blissful ignorance of what has happened to the thing that created them, and gravity, the invisible leash that keeps Earth locked in its orbit, that has been guiding our planet through the same elliptical path for 4.5 billion years. Gravity travels at the same speed as light. This was one of Albert Einstein's most profound insights, confirmed with extraordinary precision by the detection of gravitational waves in 2015. Changes in gravitational fields do not propagate instantly. They ripple outward at the speed of light, like a stone dropped in still water, expanding at 299,792 kilometers per second in all directions. So for the same 8 minutes and 20 seconds that our light is still arriving, our gravity is still arriving too. Earth is still orbiting a sun that no longer exists, held in the groove of space-time that a star carved out over billions of years, now smoothing itself away in a ripple of gravitational waves racing outward at light speed. For 8 minutes and 20 seconds, nothing has changed. The woman finishes hanging her laundry. The teenagers take photographs of the sky. The man in Portugal turns a page. The sun hangs in the sky exactly where it always was, burning with its usual casual magnificence, indifferent as a god, 9/10 of a second before the last photons reach the eye of anyone looking at it. And then the clock runs out. At 8 minutes and 20 seconds after the moment of disappearance, two things happen simultaneously, all across the entire day side of the planet. The light stops, and gravity lets go. The sky goes dark, not gradually, the way it does at sunset with the warm progression of orange and gold and violet that has been seducing human beings into poetry for as long as we have existed. There is none of that. One moment the sky is fully, gloriously lit. The next moment it is not. It is the visual equivalent of someone cutting the power to a room, instantaneous, absolute, impossible to mistake for anything natural. On the day side of the planet, every person who is outdoors is suddenly standing in a darkness they have never experienced. A darkness unlike anything that has ever existed in recorded human history, because this is not night. Night has the moon, whose reflected light we have used to navigate, to make love, to write poems, to guide ourselves home for as long as our species has existed. But the moon reflects the light of the sun, and that light is gone now, and so the moon is gone too, vanished into the darkness as thoroughly as if it never existed. What remains are the stars. For people on the day side of the planet, and remember, it is a Tuesday afternoon for roughly half the world right now, this is the first time in their lives they have ever seen stars in a daytime sky. Not the sun-bleached near invisibility of planets glimpsed at midday, but a full, overwhelming, impossible star field blazing overhead where the blue sky was a moment ago. The Milky Way, which most people living in the modern world have never seen properly because of light pollution, is suddenly overhead in its full terrifying glory. A river of light so dense and complex that it looks almost solid. It is, in a dark way, the most beautiful thing most of these people will ever see. It is also the last moment of anything resembling beauty for a very, very long time. Let's go back. Let's slow everything down and understand what has just happened at the level of physics, because the universe is doing several extraordinary things simultaneously in these first moments, and understanding them changes how you experience everything that follows. The first thing, the darkness, we have already described, but consider it more carefully. When we say the sky goes dark, we're talking about something so complete and so sudden that the human nervous system genuinely doesn't know how to process it. Human beings evolved over millions of years in a world governed by predictable cycles of light and dark. Our circadian rhythms are tuned to the rhythm of the sun. Our pupils dilate and contract in response to ambient light changes, but they do so over a period of seconds to minutes, not milliseconds. The retinas of people who are outdoors in bright afternoon sunlight at the moment of disappearance will be fully contracted, their eyes configured for maximum light input, their visual cortex is accustomed to processing an environment with solar irradiance of roughly 1000 watts per square meter. In one instant, that drops to effectively zero. The visual system goes into shock. The experience is not simply, it got dark. The experience is something more like being suddenly, completely blind. The darkness is so total, so unprecedented, so outside anything the brain has a reference frame for, that the immediate reaction for most people will be not fear but pure animal confusion, a stunned, blinking incomprehension, the same look you see on a person's face in the moment immediately after a car accident before the pain and the panic register, and then, in the seconds that follow, fear arrives. Across the day side of the planet, in cities and fields and oceans and deserts, roughly 4 billion people are experiencing the same thing simultaneously. The screaming starts in earnest within about 30 seconds. Not because people know what has happened, they don't, not yet, but because the human body, wired over millions of years of evolution to treat sudden, total darkness as an immediate threat signal, has already initiated the full cascade of fight-or-flight chemistry. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, heart rates spike, breathing accelerates, eyes dart uselessly in darkness they cannot penetrate. Car accidents begin happening on highways within the first 10 seconds. The statistics are unavoidable. There are approximately 1.4 billion motor vehicles in operation around the world at any given moment, and a significant fraction of them are in motion on the day side of the planet during a Tuesday afternoon. When the light goes, drivers on sun-facing roads lose visibility completely. Autonomous vehicles with sensor arrays beyond human eyes do better, but not entirely. Some AI systems are designed around assumptions about ambient light conditions that this scenario violates completely. In the first 2 minutes, there are tens of thousands of accidents worldwide. The aviation sector fares slightly better, because most commercial aircraft are equipped with instruments that do not depend on external light, and pilots, particularly those in the cruise phase of flight, are inside aircraft that have their own lighting. But the sudden darkness, visible through every cockpit window, triggers alert systems, and air traffic control centres around the world are suddenly flooded with calls from confused flight crews. Runways that are lit are quickly identified. The world's air traffic control systems, tested by nothing in their entire history quite like this, begin executing their emergency protocols for mass landing procedures. Now let's talk about the second thing that happens at that 8-minute 20-second mark, the gravitational release. Because this is where things get genuinely cosmic. Earth has been orbiting the Sun at an average speed of approximately 29.78 kilometers per second. That is the number, 29.78 kilometers every single second, which translates to about 107,000 kilometers per hour. This is the speed of Earth's orbital velocity, the sideways speed it maintains as it curves around the Sun's gravity. Think of an object being swung on a string. The string is tension. It is what curves the object's path from a straight line into a circle. Cut the string and the object doesn't fly outward. It flies in whatever direction it was already pointing at. The moment the string was cut, straight and steady, no longer curving. The Sun's gravity is the string. At the 8-minute 20-second mark, the gravitational wavefront, the ripple of information about the Sun's absence, racing outward from the point where the Sun was at exactly the speed of light, reaches Earth. And in that moment, the string is cut, not gradually, instantaneously. The curvature of space-time that the Sun spent 4.5 billion years carving in the fabric of the cosmos, the deep gravitational well that Earth has been rolling around the edge of for all of its existence, simply begins to flatten. The well doesn't disappear immediately. The gravitational influence of the Sun extends throughout the solar system, and the information about its absence propagates outward at light speed, meaning that at the moment Earth feels the change, Jupiter is still orbiting normally and will continue to for about 43 minutes, and Neptune won't feel anything for over 4 hours. But for Earth, the tether is gone, and so Earth goes straight. At 29.78 kilometers per second, in whatever direction it was moving at the moment the gravitational wavefront hit, Earth begins travelling in a straight line through interstellar space. There is no deceleration, there is no drift. Newton's first law of motion, the one about objects in motion staying in motion, applies with merciless simplicity. Earth is now a rogue planet, a free-floating world unattached to any star, moving at nearly 107,000 kilometers per hour, in a direction determined entirely by the accident of where in its orbit it happened to be at the moment of disappearance. The people on Earth feel none of this in any direct physical sense. There is no lurch, no shudder, no sense of suddenly falling into space. The transition is smooth because we are not changing speed, we are only changing the shape of our path. The sensation of gravity on Earth's surface, the 9.8 meters per second squared that keeps you in your chair, is produced by Earth's own mass, not by the Sun's. The Sun's gravity was only ever relevant to our orbit, not to our relationship with the ground. So you can stand up and walk around and pour yourself a glass of water and everything works exactly as it always did, in terms of Earth surface physics. What has changed is where Earth is going. On that Tuesday afternoon, at the moment of gravitational release, Earth is somewhere in its elliptical orbit, moving in a particular direction, let's say roughly perpendicular to the Sun's position, the way any object in a circular orbit moves sideways to the thing it's orbiting. That direction becomes Earth's new trajectory. Not toward the Sun, not away from it, but sideways. Earth will travel in that straight line at 29.78 kilometers per second, forever, unless it encounters another gravitational body significant enough to alter its course. The nearest star to our former Sun is Proxima Centauri, approximately 4.2 light-years away, roughly 40 trillion kilometers. At Earth's current speed, it would take approximately 43,000 years for Earth to reach Proxima Centauri, assuming it were even heading in that direction, which the orbital geometry of our specific departure angle makes extremely unlikely. For all practical purposes, Earth is headed into the void, into the darkness between stars where the nearest anything of significance might be tens of thousands of years of travel away. The first people to understand what has happened, not just that the Sun is gone, but what that mechanically means for the planet, will be astronomers and astrophysicists who are awake during this Tuesday afternoon, who are not in shock and who have access to their instruments. Within the first 15 minutes, before most of the world has processed even the basic fact of the darkness, the people at observatories and research institutions will begin to grasp the full picture, and the conversations that happen in those institutions in hushed tones over instrument panels showing impossible readings will be the most terrifying conversations in the history of human science. By the time an hour has passed since the disappearance, the world has already changed in ways that can never be undone, and the changes that are coming are already locked in by physics in the same way that a ball thrown from a cliff is committed to the ground before it gets there. Let's start with what most people are actually experiencing during this first hour, because the scientific reality and the human reality diverge sharply in interesting ways. For people on the night side of the planet at the moment of disappearance, roughly the other half of the world's population, the initial experience is oddly undramatic. They were already in darkness. Their sky already had stars. The moon, if it was visible from their location, has gone dark, which is strange, but not immediately terrifying in the way that broad daylight suddenly becoming midnight is terrifying. People on the night side have perhaps a minute or two head start on processing the situation because their nervous systems were not as violently shocked. But then they start looking at their phones, at the news, at social media, and the scale of what is happening comes crashing in through those screens. Social media, in the first hour, is the most significant information channel in human history, and also the most chaotic. The posts go up within seconds of the event. Billions of people simultaneously reaching for the same thing, their phones. The cellular networks are not designed for this kind of simultaneous load, and they begin to buckle within the first 2 minutes. In major urban areas, the networks are completely saturated within about 3 minutes, and calls start failing. But text messages, which require less bandwidth, continue getting through in bursts. And in those bursts, the collective consciousness of humanity begins assembling, piecemeal, the picture of what has happened. The language of those first posts is worth imagining. The initial wave is almost entirely questions and exclamations. What just happened? Power outage? Is this everywhere? Sun is gone? The sky went dark mid-afternoon. Is this a drill? The second wave begins within about 5 minutes, as people who have internet connections and enough presence of mind to search for information start finding nothing, because there is no information yet. The event is too new. The systems of journalism and science communication have not yet caught up. The third wave, beginning around 10 minutes in, is when the first coherent explanatory posts start appearing, and they are almost universally wrong. Every conspiracy theory, every religious interpretation, every partial and confused and frightened guess gets amplified instantly. The sun has been blocked by something. The sun has been destroyed. It is a military test. It is a natural event. God has intervened. An alien civilization has blocked it. The electromagnetic pulse has destroyed our ability to perceive it. Only one of these is correct, and the correct answer, that the sun is simply gone, that it has ceased to exist, that there is no precedent or explanation for this in all of physics, is so far outside the ability of most people to accept that even when authoritative scientific voices begin saying it, within about 20 minutes on various platforms, it is largely dismissed as impossible. Meanwhile, separate from the human drama of comprehension and communication, the physical systems of the planet are already responding. Temperature begins dropping immediately, but not catastrophically, not in the first hour. This is because of something called thermal mass, the stored heat in the atmosphere, in the oceans, in the soil, in every building and road and body of water on the planet. The Earth has been absorbing the sun's energy for 4.5 billion years, and that energy doesn't vanish just because the source switches off. The atmosphere, with all its greenhouse gases, acts as a blanket, trapping the heat that is trying to radiate away into space. In the first hour, the temperature drop at the surface is measurable but not dramatic, perhaps 1 to 2 degrees Celsius depending on location. If you were blindfolded and kept indoors, you might not notice it yet, but the direction is locked in. Every minute that passes is a minute in which more heat radiates away than comes in, because exactly 0 is coming in now. The deficit is real, and it is permanent, and it compounds with every passing second. The atmosphere itself begins an immediate and profound structural change. The sun doesn't just provide heat. It drives the atmospheric circulation of the entire planet. The temperature differential between the equator, which receives more sunlight, and the poles, which receive less, is what creates the pressure gradients that drive winds, that create weather systems, that move air and moisture around the globe. Without the sun, that differential begins to erase. Equatorial regions which were warm begin cooling. Polar regions which were already cold begin cooling at a different rate. The convective systems, the great atmospheric engines that produce everything from a gentle breeze to a Category 5 hurricane, begin to lose their power source. In the first hour, this manifests as increasingly strange and unpredictable wind patterns. Established weather systems start behaving erratically. Meteorological stations around the world begin recording anomalous readings that make no sense in the context of existing models, because the existing models all assume the sun is there. Animals know before humans understand. This is one of the most striking and reliably documented phenomena around sudden darkness. the response of the animal kingdom. During total solar eclipses, which last only a few minutes, birds return to their roosts, insects cease their daytime activity, diurnal animals become confused and lethargic, nocturnal animals stir. These are brief and easily reversible responses. What happens when the darkness is permanent is something altogether more profound. Within the first hour, bird migrations that were underway at the moment of disappearance, and there are always migrations underway since birds move continuously around the globe, collapse into confusion. Birds that navigate by sunlight lose their compass. Species that use the position of the sun as a directional reference, which includes an enormous number of migratory birds, suddenly have no reference to use. Flocks that were flying in purposeful formations begin spiraling, breaking apart, landing in confusion on whatever surface is nearest. The calls of birds, distress calls, contact calls, the particular vocalizations of species that communicate danger, rise into the dark sky in great confused choruses. Domestic animals respond with particular intensity because they are in close enough contact with humans to amplify and reflect each other's fear. Dogs howl, cats disappear under furniture, horses rear and strain against their restraints. The agricultural sector, which holds billions of chickens, cattle, pigs and other livestock in facilities designed around predictable light cycles, finds its animals simultaneously disrupted. Automated systems triggered by light sensors begin behaving strangely. Chickens that were in the middle of their daily activity cycle are suddenly experiencing what their nervous systems interpret as midnight, and they begin settling for sleep while their automated feeding systems continue operating on a schedule now rendered meaningless. In the ocean, the first hour sees the beginnings of a profound disruption to the marine food web. Phytoplankton, the microscopic plant-like organisms that form the base of the ocean's food chain, that produce roughly half of all the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere, and that collectively constitute one of the most important biological systems on the planet, immediately cease photosynthesis. Phytoplankton are extraordinarily sensitive to light. They exist in the upper layers of the ocean precisely because that's where sunlight penetrates, and they spend their entire existence performing the chemical miracle of turning sunlight and carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen. In the absence of light, that process stops as completely and immediately as a factory when someone pulls the plug on its power supply. The phytoplankton don't die in the first hour. They are resilient organisms that can survive without photosynthesis for varying periods by drawing on stored energy reserves. But the process of dying has begun, set in motion by the removal of the thing that makes their existence possible, and the clock is ticking. Meanwhile, in the governments of the world's nations, the first hour is characterized by a particular kind of paralysis that is deeply familiar from every major crisis in history. The paralysis of systems designed for normal circumstances trying to process abnormal ones. Emergency lines are overwhelmed. Heads of state are being briefed simultaneously with the initial chaos of learning what has happened. Military systems go to elevated alert levels because sudden global darkness is, in many emergency response frameworks, treated as a potential threat scenario. In the United States, NORAD goes to the equivalent of DEFCON 2 within 12 minutes, before it becomes clear that this is not a military event. Similar escalations happen in Russia, China, and other nuclear-armed states, and for a period of about 25 minutes, the world is simultaneously facing the extinction of all life and a meaningful risk of nuclear exchange, because human military systems, not yet understanding what has happened, are interpreting the darkness as a potential first strike. The nuclear threat subsides as communications between major powers confirm the global and non-military nature of the event. By about 45 minutes in, the major military powers have established sufficient communication to stand down from the highest alert levels, and the question becomes what comes next. The answer, arrived at by the scientific community long before any government is ready to say it aloud, is this: there is no next. Not in the sense of a path back to normal. The question is not how to restore what was lost. The question is how long and in what ways the human species can survive what is coming. Within the first 24 hours, 3 things are happening simultaneously in a kind of horrible symphony. The temperature is falling, the food supply systems of civilization are beginning to break down, and human societies are fracturing along the lines that stress always finds first. Let's take the temperature first, because it is the most important physical variable and the one that governs everything else. The rate of cooling in these early hours is roughly 20 degrees Celsius per 24 hours, based on estimates from climate scientists who have modelled scenarios of sudden solar absence. This number sounds manageable until you do the math. Earth's average surface temperature at the moment of disappearance is around 15 degrees Celsius, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. After 24 hours, it is around -5 degrees Celsius, 23 degrees Fahrenheit. After 48 hours, -25 Celsius. After a week, the surface temperature has plunged to somewhere around -55 to -75 degrees Celsius, depending on location, local conditions, and terrain. These numbers are averages. Coastal areas and regions near large bodies of water, particularly the tropics, where the ocean has stored enormous quantities of solar heat over the millennia, will cool more slowly because the thermal mass of the water buffers the temperature drop. The oceans are genuinely enormous heat batteries, containing more than 1,000 times the heat capacity of the entire atmosphere. Continental interiors, particularly at high latitudes, will cool much faster because they lack this buffering. The Canadian prairies, Siberia, Central Australia, the American Great Plains. These regions will experience temperature drops that exceed the average, falling below lethal thresholds much faster than coastal areas. In practical terms, within the first 24 hours, the regions of the world that are already cold at the time of disappearance begin entering genuinely lethal temperature territory. Northern Canada, Alaska, Scandinavia, Siberia, Antarctica. All of these places experience rapid drops into temperatures where unprotected humans cannot survive for more than minutes to hours. The homeless, the outdoor workers, the people caught far from shelter, they begin dying of exposure within the first few hours in the coldest regions. Emergency services, which are already overwhelmed by the chaos of the first hour, cannot respond to the scale of what is happening. Heating systems become the most critical technology on the planet within the first 12 hours. Homes with central heating, whether gas, electric or oil, are furiously running their systems. Energy consumption spikes to levels never recorded in human history. Power grids, which are designed with certain maximum load assumptions built into their engineering, begin experiencing stress that pushes beyond those assumptions. In the first 12 hours, rolling blackouts start happening across the most densely populated regions, not because the power plants have stopped working, but because the demand has exceeded what the transmission infrastructure can deliver. Power lines designed to carry a certain maximum load are carrying more, and they heat up, and circuit breakers trip, and sections of the grid go dark. The irony is devastating. In the coldest, darkest moment in human history, people's heating and lights are going out not because the system failed, but because everyone is using it at once. Natural gas systems, which don't depend on electricity in the same direct way, prove somewhat more resilient. But gas pipelines require electric compressor stations to maintain pressure, and as power grid failures cascade, gas pressure in distribution systems begins dropping. People who are relying on gas appliances for heat find them becoming less effective, then ineffective, as the pressure behind them falls. Wood burning, the oldest heating technology in human history, sees an immediate and dramatic revival. Within the first 12 hours, fires are being lit in fireplaces that haven't been used in years, in wood stoves pulled out of storage, in improvised fire pits assembled in backyards and parking lots. The demand for firewood, a resource that most of the developed world has largely abandoned as a primary fuel, immediately outstrips supply. In suburban and urban areas, wooden structures that are not currently being used for shelter begin to be viewed by some people as potential fuel. The first conflicts over firewood resources begin occurring within about 16 hours. Food systems are disrupted before most people have grasped the long-term implications for agriculture. The immediate disruption is practical. Supply chains that depend on refrigeration are compromised as power systems become unreliable. Grocery stores, restaurants, food warehouses, all of them maintain cold chains that require continuous electricity. And as the power grid strains and sputters, the cold chain breaks. Perishable food, meat, dairy, fresh produce, prepared foods, begins spoiling. In the first 24 hours, the losses are staggering. Millions of tons of food that was meant to feed people over the coming days and weeks is ruined simultaneously, just as the first hints of longer-term scarcity begin to register in people's minds. Supermarkets are overwhelmed within hours of the disappearance. The scene is familiar from hurricanes and other sudden disasters, but scaled to a degree that has no precedent. Millions of people simultaneously attempting to purchase the maximum amount of non-perishable food they can carry. Canned goods, dry pasta, rice, flour, sugar, salt, coffee, anything with a long shelf life is stripped from shelves at a rate that restocking cannot possibly keep pace with. Even in the first 24 hours before the full horror of the agricultural situation has been understood by most people, basic market psychology takes over. People fear shortage, and their fear produces the shortage it fears. The social order, which in normal times is maintained by a complex interlocking system of laws, cultural norms, economic incentives, and the perception that the future is sufficiently predictable to make cooperation worthwhile, begins developing cracks within the first 24 hours. Not everywhere, and not evenly. Human societies are enormously varied in their resilience, their social capital, their institutional strength, and their cultural responses to crisis. Some communities, particularly smaller and more tight-knit ones, show remarkable solidarity in this first day. Neighbours share resources, check on each other, pool expertise. The human capacity for communal response to shared disaster, which is one of the more admirable features of our species, is very much in evidence in many places. But in other places, major cities, socially fractured communities, areas already experiencing inequality and tension, the cracks deepen into fractures much faster. Looting begins in some urban areas within the first 6 hours. Police forces, many of whose members have gone home to be with their families, rather than report for duty, are spread impossibly thin. Emergency services are triaged in ways that are not spoken aloud, but are operationally obvious. The wealthy neighbourhoods get the response, the poor ones don't. Governments are trying to function, and some are functioning better than others. Nations with strong institutional frameworks and existing emergency preparedness systems, Japan, Germany, the Nordic countries, South Korea, managed to maintain basic order and begin coordinated emergency responses within the first 12 hours. Nations with weaker institutions, ongoing internal conflicts, or governments that depend on information control for their legitimacy. Some of them begin to fracture at the governmental level within hours. Several authoritarian regimes collapse entirely within the first 24 hours, because the information environment they depended on, the ability to control what citizens know and believe, is overwhelmed by the immediate and undeniable evidence of what is happening. Let's talk about what happens to specific sectors of civilization during this first 24 hours, because the detail reveals just how interconnected and therefore how vulnerable our systems are. The global financial system essentially ceases to operate within about 6 hours of the event, not because anyone has decided to stop it, but because the practical conditions for its operation, electronic communication networks, operational data centers, human staff capable of executing transactions, are all severely disrupted. Stock markets, which had begun experiencing unprecedented volatility the moment the first reports of the global darkness reached traders, have been halted by circuit breakers in most major exchanges within the first hour. The halts are extended indefinitely, as it becomes clear that the event is not a temporary outage. The concept of asset prices, what anything is worth in monetary terms, becomes almost metaphysically strange in a world where the physical continuity of civilization is suddenly in serious doubt. Gold, which humans have valued for thousands of years as a store of value, is being simultaneously hoarded by some people and exchanged desperately for blankets and canned food by others. The relative value of things is being recalculated by millions of people simultaneously, and the calculations are not converging. Agricultural commodities, grain futures, soybeans, corn, would theoretically be experiencing the greatest price spike in the history of commodity markets, as traders who understand what the disappearance of the sun means for crop production send by orders flooding through the system. But the system cannot process them. The exchanges are closed. The calculation is occurring in people's heads and not in the market, and what it is calculating is staggering. Every commodity tied to photosynthesis, which is essentially every food commodity, has just had its future supply reduced to zero. Not reduced, zero. No new crops will grow. The commodities that exist now are the last ones that will ever exist through natural agriculture. Transportation systems are in various states of disruption. Road transport is the most severely affected in the immediate term. The darkness, combined with rapidly deteriorating weather conditions as temperatures fall, has made outdoor driving genuinely dangerous in many regions. In areas where temperatures are falling fastest, the roads themselves are becoming hazardous as moisture on the surface freezes. Bridges, which experience temperature changes faster than solid ground, develop ice patches within the first few hours. Highway accident rates in the first 24 hours are somewhere between 10 and 50 times the normal rate, depending on region. Rail transport is somewhat more resilient. Trains are guided by their tracks and don't depend on drivers being able to see where they're going in the same way that road vehicles do. Electrified rail systems, where the trains are powered by overhead wires or third rails rather than their own fuel, are functional wherever the power grid is providing electricity. Some nations with extensive electrified rail networks, Japan, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, are using their rail systems as critical arteries for moving people toward warmer areas and moving supplies toward cold-stressed regions within the first 12 hours. In Japan, where the dense rail network and the national culture of organized disaster response intersect with remarkable effectiveness, Shinkansen bullet trains are being diverted from their commercial routes to emergency evacuation runs within about 4 hours of the event. Maritime transport, the backbone of global trade, which in normal times moves about 80% of the world's goods by weight, is disrupted but not destroyed. Ships at sea when the event occurs are in a peculiarly isolated position. The crews of ocean-going vessels surrounded by water that is cooling but retains significant heat are in some ways better insulated from the immediate crisis than land-based populations. The ships themselves are not going anywhere dangerous. They are in open ocean, which is not freezing at the surface yet, and their own power systems and heating are intact. But their purpose, carrying cargo to ports that are now struggling to function, is suddenly unclear. Where do you take a cargo ship when the global economy has stopped? Where do you go when your home port may be in a city that is in chaos? The decisions that ship captains make in the first 24 hours, whether to continue their voyages, where to seek port, how to prioritize the needs of their crew against the orders of shipping companies that may no longer be functionally operating, these decisions are made with minimal guidance from shore. Maritime communication systems are working, but the information coming from shore is chaotic, contradictory, and often incomplete. Many captains make the pragmatic decision to head for the nearest major port with a functional harbour and figure out the rest later. Air transport, as noted, is landing its aircraft and halting new departures. The approximately 10,000 commercial aircraft that are airborne at any given moment worldwide are in the process of executing emergency landings at the nearest suitable airports. Air traffic control systems, operating under extraordinary pressure, are managing this remarkably well in most regions. The protocols for simultaneous emergency landings are practiced, and while the scale is unprecedented, the individual procedures are well understood. Most aircraft land safely. The passengers aboard those aircraft, stepping off planes at airports that are simultaneously trying to manage their own crisis, enter a world that has changed completely during the flight they were on. Military systems around the world are in a state that can only be described as organized confusion. The initial alert escalations, the near-nuclear incidents of the first 20 to 30 minutes, have been stood down, but the military establishments of the world's nations are now trying to figure out what their role is in a catastrophe for which no military doctrine exists. The traditional roles of national militaries, defending borders, projecting power, deterring adversaries, are all suddenly rendered somewhat irrelevant when the adversary is physics itself. But militaries are also, in most nations, the most organised, most equipped, and most disciplined large organisations available for emergency response. Military assets, transport aircraft, engineering corps, field hospitals, communication systems, logistics expertise are exactly what the crisis needs. The decisions made in the first 24 hours about how to redirect military assets toward humanitarian response versus national security versus resource control will determine the survival odds of millions of people. In nations where the military has strong civilian oversight and clear humanitarian mandates, most of the NATO countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the transition to humanitarian operations begins relatively quickly. In nations where military culture is more oriented toward regime protection and internal control, the transition is slower or doesn't happen at all, with predictable consequences for civilian outcomes. The communications infrastructure, arguably the most important thing that still functions, the nervous system of a coordinated human response to this crisis, holds better than feared. Mobile networks are saturated but not entirely failed. The internet, built to survive nuclear war in its backbone architecture, routes around failures and keeps most of its traffic flowing, though at reduced speeds. Satellite internet systems, which don't depend on ground-based infrastructure, prove particularly valuable in areas where terrestrial networks have been compromised. Scientists, by the end of the first 24 hours, have painted a picture for governments that is accurate, comprehensive, and almost unimaginably grim. The consensus, delivered in simultaneous briefings to heads of government around the world at roughly the 18-hour mark, is simple. Without the sun, the surface of the Earth will become uninhabitable for most life within weeks. The window for meaningful action, for moving critical populations and resources underground, to geothermal sources to nuclear-powered facilities, is measured in days to a few weeks at the outside. After that, the cold will be so severe that outside travel without extreme cold weather protection will be impossible, and the energy costs of maintaining habitable temperatures above ground will exceed what can be sustained. The question that governments now face, the question that has no good answer, only a range of terrible ones, is who gets to survive? By the end of the first week, the numbers tell a story that most people can no longer avoid confronting. Average global surface temperatures have dropped from 15 degrees Celsius to somewhere around -55 to -70 degrees Celsius. The specific number varies enormously by location. Coastal tropics might still be at -20, which is cold but theoretically survivable, with adequate clothing and shelter and heating. Continental interiors at high latitudes are at temperatures that kill unprotected humans in minutes. Weather systems, deprived of their solar engine, have largely collapsed into an eerie, unprecedented stillness. The great atmospheric circulations, the Hadley cells, the jet streams, the monsoon systems, are dying for lack of the temperature gradient that drives them. The air above most of the world is becoming still in a way it has not been for as long as Earth has had an atmosphere. The stillness is deeply strange. People who have survived severe cold weather disasters describe the silence as one of the most disorienting features. Without wind, without the sounds of birds and insects and outdoor human activity, without the hum of normal human life, without even the distant sound of traffic, which has largely stopped as fuel becomes precious and roads become dangerous. The world outside sheltered areas has gone into a silence so profound that it feels like the world has been placed inside a glass jar and sealed. Small bodies of water, ponds, small lakes, shallow bays, have frozen solid. Not just covered with ice, but frozen all the way through. Solid blocks of ice that a few days ago were ecosystems full of living things. The ice sheets on the surfaces of larger bodies of water are thickening rapidly, and as they thicken, they do something paradoxical and important. They insulate the water below. This is a crucial physical fact about water and ice. Ice is a thermal insulator, and a layer of ice on the surface of a body of water significantly slows the rate at which the water beneath it loses heat. The larger and deeper the body of water, the more pronounced this effect. Lakes will freeze from the surface down, and the deepest lake bottoms will retain liquid water for much longer than the surfaces. The ocean, with its enormous thermal mass and depth, is a different matter entirely. We'll get to that. But the most important thing happening in the first week, the thing that will determine the fate of virtually all life on Earth's surface over the months to come, is the death of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, the process by which plants and photosynthetic microorganisms capture light energy and use it to build organic molecules, has essentially stopped. It stopped at the moment of disappearance, with the last photons. Individual plants did not die instantly. They have reserves of stored sugars and other compounds that allow them to continue metabolic processes in the dark, just as a person can continue functioning after a meal, even as they stop eating. But the reserves are being drawn down and not replenished, and the timeline varies by species. Small annuals, annual flowers, most grasses, herb crops, many food plants, begin visibly wilting and dying within the first 2 to 4 days. These are plants with minimal energy storage, living fast and reproducing quickly, dependent on continuous photosynthesis to support their rapid metabolism. Without it, they fail quickly. Fields of wheat and corn and rice that were weeks or months from harvest die in place, their stalks going yellow and then grey in the cold and the dark, the grain that would have fed millions of people becoming worthless, as temperatures drop below the range that allows even biological decomposition to proceed normally. Perennial plants, shrubs, bushes, the established root systems of grasslands, last somewhat longer, perhaps a couple of weeks, drawing on the energy stored in their root systems. But even these are failing by the end of the first week, their energy reserves depleted, their tissues increasingly killed by the cold. Trees are the most resilient of the terrestrial plant kingdom in this crisis, and this is genuinely significant. Large trees, particularly slow-growing species with massive root systems and dense wood, have energy reserves that can sustain limited metabolic function for a surprisingly long time. Estimates from plant biologists suggest that some large trees, old oaks, ancient conifers, mature tropical hardwoods, could survive without photosynthesis for several decades, not through active growth, but through a kind of deep dormancy, drawing on their stored reserves with glacial slowness. They will not grow, they will not flower or set fruit, but they will technically remain alive, their vascular systems still moving small quantities of water, their bark and wood maintaining integrity. This survival is ecologically almost meaningless, because the food chain that depends on trees requires not just that trees survive, but that they produce leaves, fruit, seeds, flowers, and without photosynthesis none of that production occurs. The seeds and nuts and berries that animals depend on are either already on the ground from the previous autumn, or simply not going to be produced. The leaves that would have emerged in spring that would have fed everything from caterpillars to deer will not emerge. The trees will be alive, but the ecosystem they supported will be dead. The food chain begins collapsing at both ends simultaneously, and the speed of the collapse is breathtaking even in the context of geological time. Consider what photosynthesis actually is. It is the entry point for energy into virtually every food chain on the surface of the Earth. The sun's energy, which is itself the product of nuclear fusion reactions in the sun's core, converting hydrogen to helium and releasing energy in the process, is captured by plants and converted into chemical energy in the form of sugar and starch. Everything else eats that. Herbivores eat the plants directly, carnivores eat the herbivores, omnivores eat both. Decomposers break down the dead, recycling the nutrients but still ultimately depending on the flow of energy from sunlight through photosynthesizers to maintain the system. Remove the photosynthesizers and you remove the energy input. The food chain doesn't just weaken, it collapses tier by tier from the bottom up. Herbivores have access to the existing stock of plant material, the grass that was growing, the leaves that fell last autumn, the stored grains in silos. But this stock is not being replenished. Across the first week, herbivores in the wild begin experiencing the food shortage. Deer, rabbits, cattle, horses, sheep, all of them are competing for a fixed and rapidly diminishing supply of edible plant material, while the cold simultaneously increases their caloric needs. Large grazing animals, which require enormous quantities of food daily, begin showing signs of starvation within the first 10 days. Insects, which are a critical link in the food chain, and which collectively represent a greater biomass than all vertebrates combined, respond faster. The temperature drop pushes most insect species below their thermal activity thresholds within the first few days. Bees, which need temperatures above about 10 degrees Celsius to fly, stop flying. Pollination, which is already moot since no new plant growth is occurring, stops. Insects that were not already in overwintering dormancy die of cold and starvation within the first week. In the ocean, the phytoplankton crisis is already becoming a full-scale ecological disaster. Phytoplankton, which produce roughly 50% of Earth's atmospheric oxygen and form the base of the marine food web, have been without light for a week now. Their populations, measured in satellite data from the days before the disappearance, were vast. Estimates suggest the global ocean contains something on the order of 100 to 200 million tons of phytoplankton biomass. That biomass is now dying. The process is not instantaneous. Phytoplankton can persist in darkness for varying periods depending on species and cellular energy reserves, but the direction is clear and irreversible. As phytoplankton die, they sink. Their small bodies, drifting downward through the water column, constitute a rain of organic material, what oceanographers call marine snow, that feeds deep-sea organisms. This brief, intense pulse of organic material from the dying phytoplankton layer will actually support deep-sea communities for a time, a kind of ecological death feast. But once it's over, it's over. The deep-sea communities that depend on this rain of material from above will begin declining, and only the communities around hydrothermal vents, which produce their own energy chemically independent of sunlight, will continue to function normally. For the human survivors, this first week is the period in which the immediate survival challenges, warmth, shelter, basic food, and water, are dominant, and the longer-term agricultural catastrophe is still somewhat abstract. People are fighting to stay warm, to maintain their heating systems, to find fuel. But a second-order crisis is building underneath the noise of the immediate emergency, and it has to do with water. The global freshwater system is deeply solar dependent, not just because the sun powers the water cycle and the evaporation and precipitation that replenish rivers and aquifers. That disruption will take months and years to fully manifest. But because the infrastructure through which humans access water in the modern world depends on electricity, water pumps, water treatment facilities, distribution systems. As the power grid becomes unreliable during the first week, water systems begin failing in ways that compound the heating crisis. Clean water, which most people in the developed world access through a tap without any thought, becomes a resource that must be actively managed and conserved. The standard recommendation in any emergency, store water, have backup supplies, suddenly applies to literally every person on the planet simultaneously. Sanitation is the shadow crisis behind the water crisis. Modern sewage treatment systems depend on electricity to run pumps and aeration systems. As power becomes unreliable, sewage treatment degrades. Untreated waste is a disease vector, and disease, which is already threatening to explode in the cramped conditions of emergency shelters, becomes a serious secondary killer within the first 2 weeks. The medical system, which was already under severe strain from the shock, trauma, and exposure injuries of the first days, faces an additional burden: hypothermia, frostbite, and cold-related cardiovascular events. Human bodies are not adapted to rapid temperature drops. The threshold for hypothermia, core body temperature falling below 35 degrees Celsius, is reached surprisingly quickly in inadequate shelter, and the first week sees hospital emergency departments overwhelmed with cold injury cases in regions where the temperature has fallen fastest. Hospitals that have maintained backup power through generators or have access to the power grid are functioning, but under extreme pressure. Those that have lost power are improvising in conditions that would have been unimaginable a week earlier. The psychological crisis, which runs parallel to all the physical ones, is perhaps the least well managed. There is no emergency protocol for tell 8 billion people simultaneously that the world as they knew it is over. The closest analogues in history are the Black Death, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the various civilizational traumas of the 20th century, all happened over periods long enough for human psychology to have some adaptation time. The disappearance of the sun is instantaneous and total, and the comprehension of what it means arrives over the following days with no buffer. The stages of grief, which the psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously described as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, are playing out collectively across the species, but not evenly, not sequentially, and not at the same pace for everyone. Denial dominates the first hours, giving way to shock and confusion, and then to a kind of frantic activity as people try to respond to the immediate physical threats. Anger arrives quickly, and it needs a target. The targets it finds, other groups, other nations, other classes, are not the right ones, because the actual cause is a physics event that cannot be blamed on any human decision. But anger, looking for something to do with itself, rarely stops to check whether its target is deserving. The communities that hold together best in the first week are the ones with existing strong social bonds and clear leadership structures, not necessarily formal governmental authority, but the informal authority of people who are known, trusted, and competent. A neighbourhood that has a retired engineer who knows how to maintain a backup generator, and a retired nurse who knows how to treat cold injuries, and a former community organiser who knows how to coordinate resource distribution, will survive better than a neighbourhood with none of these things regardless of their relative economic status. The social capital that is accumulated over years of normal life, the relationships, the trust, the informal knowledge of each other's strengths, becomes the most valuable resource in the first weeks of the crisis. And from space, though there is no longer a sun to provide the energy for Earth-orbiting satellites to use their solar panels, and so the satellite infrastructure is beginning to degrade as power reserves are depleted. The last images taken of Earth show a planet already beginning to change. The Terminator line, the boundary between day and night, which has been a constant and defining feature of Earth as seen from space for billions of years, is gone. There is only darkness on one side and the same darkness on the other. The familiar blue and white marble, the most important image in the history of photography, is gone. What is there now is harder to describe. A sphere of rock and ice and ocean, its surface changing beneath clouds that are themselves beginning to fail as the temperature drops below the condensation points that form them, headed in a straight line into the interstellar void at 107,000 kilometers per hour. 30 days, 1 month. In the scope of geological time, a month is an eye blink, less meaningful than a rounding error. But in the scope of human experience, a month is long enough for almost everything to change beyond recognition. By the end of the first month, average surface temperatures across most of the planet are below negative 100 degrees Celsius. The tropics, buffered by the thermal mass of the ocean, are somewhat warmer, perhaps negative 30 to negative 50 degrees Celsius at the immediate coastline, where the ocean beneath its thickening ice layer is still releasing stored heat. The ocean surface has ice coverage that extends far from what were once the polar regions. The Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets, already extensive before the disappearance, have merged with ice forming in temperate latitudes to create expanding fields of ice that are moving toward the equator at the margins. The atmosphere is changing in ways that go beyond simple temperature. The water cycle, which is driven by solar energy evaporating water from the ocean surface and transporting it through the atmosphere as water vapor before it condenses and falls as precipitation, has largely shut down. Evaporation requires heat energy to break the hydrogen bonds holding water molecules together in the liquid state. Without the sun, the heat that was driving this evaporation is gone, and as ocean temperatures drop, the rate of evaporation falls. Rainfall and snowfall continue for a while, drawing on the moisture already in the atmosphere, but it is progressively drier snow, crystalline, cold, light, and less of it. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas and which has been doing some work to slow the initial temperature drop by trapping outgoing infrared radiation, begins to behave oddly at extremely low temperatures. Carbon dioxide freezes at negative 78.5 degrees Celsius, and as temperatures in the coldest regions plunge below this threshold, atmospheric CO2 begins condensing out of the atmosphere and precipitating as dry ice. This is not just a curiosity, it is a cascade event. As CO2 is removed from the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect weakens further. Weaker greenhouse effect means faster cooling. Faster cooling means more CO2 precipitates. The feedback loop, once started, accelerates itself. This is the same process, incidentally, that plays out seasonally at Mars's polar caps, where CO2 freezes out of the Martian atmosphere in winter and sublimates back in spring. Earth is beginning to experience what Mars experiences, only without the spring to reverse it. The human situation by the end of the first month is one of radical geographic consolidation. The population of the world, which was approximately 8 billion people at the moment of the disappearance, has contracted significantly. The numbers are necessarily approximate because coordinated data collection has been severely disrupted, but credible estimates from what remains of the world's epidemiological and emergency management infrastructure suggest that somewhere between 500 million and 1.5 billion people have died in the first month. The deaths are primarily from 3 causes: exposure, freezing, conflict over resources, and the cascading failure of medical infrastructure. The inability to maintain the cold chains for vaccines and medicines, the loss of power to hospitals and care facilities, the breakdown of emergency response systems. The survivors are not uniformly distributed. They cluster, with striking statistical regularity, around certain geographical and infrastructural features: geothermal resources, nuclear power plants, large urban centres with intact power grids and large heating stocks, and areas near the coast where ocean thermal buffering has slowed the temperature drop. Iceland, which is heated primarily by geothermal energy that has nothing to do with the sun, has survived better than almost any other nation on Earth proportionally. Iceland's geothermal systems tap directly into the heat of Earth's interior, and that interior heat is entirely independent of the sun. The same heat that has been powering Iceland's homes and providing its greenhouses with the energy to grow tomatoes in the middle of the North Atlantic continues to work. Iceland's geothermal plants are running at full capacity. The country's greenhouses, converted to food production with desperate efficiency, are growing what they can under artificial lighting powered by geothermal electricity. Iceland, with a population of approximately 370,000 people, has become one of the most strategically valuable places on Earth. New Zealand and parts of Japan, both of which have significant geothermal resources and are surrounded by the thermal buffering of the Pacific Ocean, are also holding on better than most. For the majority of survivors, however, the situation is one of organised or disorganised compression into whatever structures can be heated. Urban apartment buildings, which concentrate body heat and allow for efficient centralised heating, prove more survivable than dispersed suburban housing. Multi-storey concrete buildings, which have high thermal mass and retain heat well, are better than lightweight frame construction. Industrial facilities, factories, warehouses, server farms, which often have significant waste heat generation and robust power infrastructure, become refugee centres in many cities. The food situation is the defining crisis of this first month. Stored food, the world's stockpiles of grain, the canned goods, the preserved and dried foods, is the primary food source for survivors. The global food system, which operates on a principle of relatively low inventory and high turnover, was not designed for the complete collapse of ongoing food production. Before the disappearance, the world had roughly 100 days of grain reserves, meaning that global grain stores, if evenly distributed, would provide the world's current population with its daily calories for about 100 days. But the distribution is not even, and population is not static, and the number of people needing those reserves is rapidly decreasing. As the first month ends, the complex mathematics of food distribution. How much is there? Where is it? Who controls it? Who can reach it? Who needs it most? Is the central political question of every surviving government on Earth. Some governments are managing this question with astonishing effectiveness, implementing strict rationing systems that are mathematically precise and enforced with enough social trust to mostly work. Others have collapsed into armed conflict over resources. The distinction between these outcomes tracks closely with pre-existing social capital, institutional trust, and political culture, the same factors that predict disaster response outcomes in normal times, amplified to civilizational scale. At 1 year after the disappearance, Earth is a different world. Average surface temperature is now approximately -100 degrees Fahrenheit, -73 degrees Celsius, on the global average, though as always this number conceals enormous variation. Ocean-adjacent areas in the tropics may still be around -30 to -40 Celsius at the shoreline, warmed by the enormous thermal reservoir beneath the ice. Continental interiors have reached temperatures that exceed anything in recorded human history on the surface, comparable to the coldest recorded temperatures in Antarctica, -89 degrees Celsius at the extreme, and exceeding them in some locations as the cooling continues. The oceans deserve particular attention here, because they are doing something extraordinary and important. The ocean is not freezing solid. This is a critical fact. The surface of the ocean has extensive ice coverage. By the end of the first year, ice sheets have spread from the polar regions deep into what were once the temperate and even subtropical ocean zones. The surface ice in the tropics is still thin and intermittent, a few centimeters to a meter in places, but it is there and spreading. However, beneath that ice, the ocean remains liquid. The thermal mass of the world's oceans, which contain more than 1,000 times the heat capacity of the entire atmosphere, means that the heat stored in the deep ocean will take not months but centuries, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years to fully dissipate. The deep ocean, below about 1,000 meters depth, is actually quite cold even normally, around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, and this deep water has always been heated primarily by geothermal flux from the ocean floor, not by the sun. The hydrothermal vents on the mid-ocean ridges and elsewhere continue to pour their superheated, mineral-rich water into the ocean. The chemosynthetic ecosystems around those vents, the tube worms and vent shrimp and microbial mats that live at temperatures of 100 to 400 degrees Celsius, powered entirely by chemical energy from Earth's interior, are completely unaffected by the disappearance of the sun. They don't know the sun is gone. They never needed it. This is perhaps the most important biological fact of the post-sun Earth. There are places where life is continuing, robust and thriving, precisely as it was before. The hydrothermal vent ecosystems, discovered only in 1977 and revolutionizing our understanding of where life can exist, are the lifeboat of biology on a sunless Earth, and they are not small. Scientists estimate there are somewhere between 500 and 1,000 active hydrothermal vent sites scattered across the world's ocean floors, ranging from the famous black smokers of the mid-Atlantic ridge to the more diffuse warm vents of the Pacific Ocean basins. The total biomass of vent ecosystems is difficult to estimate, but it is substantial and entirely self-sustaining. These ecosystems are not accessible to human beings, at least not in ways that can support large populations. The vents are at crushing depths, under kilometers of water, in total darkness and extreme pressure and heat. Sending robotic systems to observe them was a triumph of technology. Sending humans to live there is not a viable survival strategy for the species. But the existence of these ecosystems matters enormously as a proof of concept. Life survives on Earth, powered by Earth's internal heat, and will continue to do so for billions of years regardless of what has happened to the Sun. Earth is not dead. It is profoundly changed, but it is not dead. The human survivors at the 1-year mark number somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion, clustered in geothermally active zones, nuclear power plant vicinities, and the most energy-dense urban areas that have maintained enough social cohesion to organize collective survival. The technological infrastructure of civilization has contracted enormously, not because the technology itself has failed, but because the energy to run it and the social organization to maintain it have both been massively reduced. The internet exists in fragments. Some satellite systems are still operational. Radio communication is active and vital. Nuclear power plants, which are generating electricity entirely independent of the sun, using the heat of controlled nuclear reactions, are the most important technological assets in the human world. They have become the literal centers of human civilization, the places around which the surviving remnants of organized society orbit. Growing food without sunlight requires artificial lighting, and artificial lighting requires electricity, and electricity, in the post-sun world, comes primarily from nuclear power and geothermal energy. The physics of this calculation are grim but workable in principle. LED grow lights, which are extraordinarily efficient at converting electricity into the specific wavelengths of light that plants use for photosynthesis, can sustain plant growth underground. The yield per square meter is lower than field agriculture, but it is possible, it works, and it is happening in thousands of facilities around the world, from purpose-built underground growing facilities to improvised setups in industrial buildings, parking garages, and mine shafts. The first year also sees the complete cessation of above-ground plant life across all but the most marginal geothermal areas where volcanic activity warms the soil above the threshold for survival. Iceland's geothermally heated greenhouses, as noted, continue operating. In a few other places, parts of New Zealand, Japan, the Azores, geothermal heat keeps certain localized areas marginally warmer than the surrounding landscape, and in these places some plant life persists. But across the vast majority of Earth's surface, the terrestrial biosphere is dead. The great forests of the Amazon, which at their peak held perhaps 390 billion trees and produced roughly 20% of the world's oxygen through photosynthesis, are gone, frozen, their wood preserved in the cold like a vast natural freezer, their soil microbiomes destroyed by temperatures far below any threshold for biological activity. The oxygen situation is worth addressing, because it is a common concern and the answer is more reassuring than most people expect. Earth's atmosphere contains an enormous quantity of oxygen, roughly 1.2 times 10 to the 18th power kilograms of the stuff, accumulated over billions of years of photosynthesis and not easily depleted. Even if all photosynthesis on Earth's surface stopped immediately and permanently, and even if respiration continued at pre-disappearance rates, it would take roughly 100,000 years for atmospheric oxygen to drop to levels that begin to affect human health. The survivors in the first year are not suffocating. This is not the oxygen crisis. The crises are heat and food, and both are being desperately managed. What the survivors are also managing in ways that don't make for dramatic headlines but are quietly crucial is mental health. The psychological burden of the post-sun world, permanent darkness outside, or rather, permanent starfield, which is beautiful but alien, the loss of the natural world, the confinement, the uncertainty about long-term survival. These are extraordinary stresses by any measure, and yet human beings have survived extraordinary psychological stresses throughout history, And one of the things that the research on trauma and resilience consistently shows is that community is the most powerful protective factor. People who have strong social bonds, who have a clear sense of shared purpose, who feel like they matter to other people and that other people matter to them, these people show remarkable psychological resilience even in catastrophic circumstances. The underground settlements of the first year are not, by any psychological measure, easy places to live. They are cramped and artificial and dimly lit, and they smell of recycled air and the particular chemical signatures of hydroponic growing systems and the thousands of human bodies sharing enclosed space. But they are full of people who need each other desperately and who know it, and that shared necessity, is the foundation of something real. Emergency medicine practitioners who have worked in disaster zones consistently describe the same phenomenon. The acute phase of a disaster, when survival is uncertain and everyone is focused on immediate needs, often produces a remarkable social cohesion. People give more freely. They look after each other with greater intensity. The ordinary selfishness of daily life recedes in the face of genuine collective threat. The challenge is sustaining that cohesion after the acute phase, when the immediate crisis transitions into the long grinding reality of living in a fundamentally changed world. That transition, from emergency to new normal, is the psychological moment that determines whether communities hold together or fracture. And in the post-sun world, unlike in the aftermath of a hurricane or earthquake, there is no recovery period in which the world returns to what it was. The new normal is permanent, managing that psychological reality, helping people grieve what was lost, find meaning in what remains, invest emotionally in a future that is genuinely different but still worth having, is one of the most important challenges of the first year and all the years that follow. Art emerges. This should not be surprising because it always does in conditions of extremity, but it is striking how quickly and how powerfully creative expression appears in the survival communities. Music especially, requiring no materials beyond a human voice and sometimes a few simple instruments, producible in the dark as well as the light, communal in a way that painting and writing are not. Music becomes one of the defining cultural expressions of the first months. People sing together in underground shelters. They compose songs about the sun, about the darkness, about what they remember and what they hope for. These songs are not technically sophisticated by pre-disappearance standards, but they are real, and they are doing what music has always done, telling people that their experience matters, that it is worth expressing, that other people share it. Literature emerges more slowly but with equal intensity. The accounts written in the first year, diaries, letters, official records, the beginnings of what will eventually become the canonical historical documents of the post-sun era, are among the most vivid and emotionally direct writing that humans have ever produced. The people writing them know that what they are recording is unprecedented, that the record they create may be the only one, that future generations will rely on what they write to understand what it was like. That awareness gives the writing a particular quality, urgent and precise and unafraid of scale, trying to capture not just events, but the experience of events, the texture of living through them. Let's step back from the immediate human drama and look at the deeper timeline. Because what happens to Earth over thousands and millions of years without the sun is one of the most extraordinary scenarios in planetary science, and understanding it changes how you think about both the fragility and the resilience of this planet. The concept of seasons disappears. Seasons on Earth exist because of Earth's axial tilt. The 23.5 degree tilt of the planet's axis relative to the plane of its orbit around the Sun, which causes the northern hemisphere to receive more direct sunlight during one half of the year and less during the other. Without the Sun, the axial tilt remains. Earth still tilts at 23.5 degrees relative to its former orbital plane, but there is nothing for it to tilt toward or away from. There is no summer hemisphere and no winter hemisphere. There is just the uniform cold of a sunless world, experienced equally everywhere on the surface. The Moon continues orbiting Earth. The Moon's orbit around Earth is governed by Earth's gravity, not the Sun's directly, so the two bodies travel together into the interstellar dark. The tides rise and fall under the frozen surface of the ocean, the water beneath the ice responding to the Moon's pull exactly as it always has. But with no sun to illuminate the Moon, the lunar cycle is dark. A new moon is dark, and a full moon is equally dark. The Moon is still there, it is just invisible. The calendar, that extraordinary human invention for tracking the sun's apparent position in the sky, for predicting the seasons, for organising agricultural and social life around the regular rhythms of the solar year, is suddenly meaningless. Not just impractical, but conceptually empty. A year was defined as the time it takes the Earth to complete one orbit around the Sun. There is no longer an orbit. There is only the straight-line journey into darkness, measured in whatever units the survivors find useful. Some communities will adopt a convention of calling the period of approximately 365 days a year simply as a matter of practical continuity. Others will abandon it entirely and develop new temporal frameworks appropriate to their new situation. Let's step back from the immediate human drama and look at the deeper timeline, because what happens to Earth over thousands and millions of years without the Sun is one of the most extraordinary scenarios in planetary science, and understanding it changes how you think about both the fragility and the resilience of this planet. In the short to medium term, the first few hundred years after the disappearance, Earth's surface continues to cool toward an equilibrium point. That equilibrium is determined by the balance between the heat flowing outward from Earth's interior, geothermal heat flux, and the heat radiating away from Earth's surface into space. The geothermal heat flux is small by the standards of solar energy. The Sun was delivering about 1,361 watts per square meter to the top of Earth's atmosphere, while geothermal flux averages only about 0.09 watts per square meter. But it is not zero, and it is not going away. Earth's interior heat is sustained by two sources: the primordial heat trapped when the planet formed from colliding planetesimals 4.5 billion years ago, and the heat generated by the decay of radioactive elements, primarily uranium, thorium, and potassium, in the planet's crust and mantle. These sources of heat will persist for billions of years. The equilibrium surface temperature for a planet with Earth's composition and size, receiving no solar energy but with Earth's geothermal heat flux, was calculated by David Stevenson, a planetary scientist at Caltech, to be approximately negative 220 degrees Celsius, negative 364 degrees Fahrenheit. This is colder than Pluto. It is colder than some of the moons of Jupiter. It is not quite absolute zero, but it is extraordinarily cold, colder than anywhere naturally occurring on Earth's surface today by more than 130 degrees. At this temperature, the atmosphere begins to experience profound changes. Nitrogen, which makes up 78% of Earth's atmosphere, has a boiling point of negative 196 degrees Celsius. As temperatures approach and then exceed this threshold, nitrogen gas begins to liquefy and eventually freeze. This process takes centuries to thousands of years, because the enormous quantity of nitrogen in the atmosphere means the phase change takes a very long time. But eventually, over perhaps tens of thousands of years, Earth's nitrogen atmosphere would largely condense and freeze out, coating the planet's surface with a thin layer of frozen nitrogen mixed with other solidified atmospheric gases. Oxygen, with a boiling point of negative 183 degrees Celsius, would follow a similar path, liquefying and then freezing. Carbon dioxide, as noted earlier, freezes at a much higher temperature, negative 78.5 degrees Celsius, and would precipitate out much sooner in the cooling timeline. The result over thousands of years is an Earth that would be almost completely unrecognizable. The atmosphere would be thin and diminishing, composed increasingly of noble gases like argon, which makes up about 0.9% of current air and has a boiling point of negative 186 degrees Celsius, lower than nitrogen. The surface would be covered in layers of frozen gases and water ice extending from the poles to the equator. The oceans, protected by their enormous thermal mass and by the insulating layer of surface ice, would be the last liquid water on Earth's surface. But they too would eventually freeze over, with only the deep ocean near hydrothermal vents remaining liquid indefinitely. Earth as a rogue planet would, over this long timeline, become something that astrophysicists call a Steppenwolf planet, a concept proposed by researchers at the University of Chicago, referring to a world that drifts through interstellar space with a frozen surface but potentially liquid water beneath a thick ice cap, sustained by geothermal heat. Like a lone wolf wandering the galactic steppe. The name is evocative and fitting. The Earth's magnetic field, which is generated by convection currents in the liquid outer core, driven by the temperature differential between the inner core and the mantle, would continue to function for billions of years after the Sun's disappearance. The core's heat production through radioactive decay is largely independent of solar energy. Earth's magnetic field would continue to shield whatever remains on or near the surface from cosmic radiation, even as the atmosphere desiccates and freezes. This is actually important for any life forms that might persist near geothermal sources. The magnetic field provides a degree of protection from the harsh radiation environment of interstellar space, which is more intense without the Sun's heliosphere to deflect incoming cosmic rays. Speaking of the heliosphere, this is something that changes almost immediately with the Sun's disappearance. The heliosphere is the enormous magnetic bubble created by the solar wind, the constant stream of charged particles flowing outward from the Sun that envelops the entire solar system and extends far out into interstellar space, past Neptune, past the Kuiper belt, past the inner edge of the Oort cloud. This bubble protects the planets from the full intensity of interstellar cosmic radiation. Without the Sun, the solar wind stops and the heliosphere collapses. The timeline for this is relatively rapid, perhaps a year or so for the collapse to propagate through the former solar system. After that, Earth is exposed directly to interstellar space, including significantly higher levels of galactic cosmic rays. For surviving life on the surface, this increased radiation is an additional stress. For life in the deep ocean, shielded by kilometers of water, it is largely irrelevant. This is the question that, once the horror settles into something approaching philosophical acceptance, people want answered. Not, can we fix it? Clearly we cannot. Not, can we avoid it? It has already happened in our thought experiment. But, given everything that physics and biology and technology and human ingenuity bring to the table, could some meaningful remnant of humanity survive? And for how long? The honest answer, from scientists who have thought carefully about this, is yes, but at enormous cost, and in radically reduced and transformed form. The survival case rests on several genuine and important facts. First, nuclear energy is completely independent of the Sun. Nuclear fission reactors, of which there are currently about 440 operational worldwide in 32 countries, use the heat generated by controlled nuclear chain reactions to produce electricity. The fuel for those reactors, primarily enriched uranium, has nothing to do with sunlight. Nuclear fuel is mined from the ground and will continue to be available regardless of solar conditions. Existing nuclear fuel stockpiles, even without new mining operations, could power significant nuclear facilities for decades. If new mining could be maintained, which requires energy to run the mining equipment, but that energy can come from the nuclear plants themselves, the supply could extend for centuries. Geothermal energy is the other pillar of the survival case, and it is potentially even more durable than nuclear. Iceland, as we have noted, is already running its entire energy system on geothermal heat that has nothing to do with the Sun. Other regions with significant geothermal resources, New Zealand, Japan, the Philippines, parts of the western United States, East Africa's Rift Valley, Iceland's geographic neighbours in the North Atlantic, have the potential to expand geothermal energy production significantly in a post-Sun world. Enhanced geothermal systems which pump water into deep hot rock to create heat exchangers can theoretically exploit geothermal energy in regions without natural geothermal features, though this requires substantial engineering and energy investment. Growing food without sunlight is technically feasible, and it is already being done on a small scale. Vertical farms, which grow crops under artificial LED lighting in stacked layers, are operational facilities today in Japan, the United States, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. The energy efficiency of LED grow lighting has improved dramatically in recent years. Modern LEDs, designed for plant growth, can produce photosynthetically usable light with an efficiency that makes underground or indoor food production viable, if energy-intensive. A nuclear-powered or geothermally powered underground growing facility could, in principle, produce substantial quantities of food. The caloric density of certain crops, mushrooms, which don't require light and can grow on organic waste material, are particularly valuable here, is high enough to sustain meaningful populations in relatively small footprints. The All-Fed, the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, is a real organisation that has studied exactly this kind of scenario, including the aftermath of a sun-blocking event like nuclear winter. Their analysis suggests that with proper planning, up to 80% of the world's population could survive a sun-blocking event through alternative food production. In the scenario of complete and permanent solar absence, the numbers are grimmer, but the principle, that human ingenuity and industrial food production can sustain populations without agriculture, is sound. The specific survival strategies are both high-tech and sometimes surprisingly low-tech. Mushroom cultivation, which requires no light and can use dead wood and agricultural waste as substrate, can be scaled massively. Bacteria fermentation, growing protein-rich single-cell organisms in vats of nutrients, is possible with electricity and basic chemical inputs. Algae cultivation, which requires light, but can use artificial light from nuclear or geothermal electricity, is enormously productive in terms of calories per square meter. Fish farming in heated underground facilities, using the underground aquifer water kept liquid by geothermal heat, is another viable food source. Hydrogen-producing bacteria are another less obvious food technology that becomes relevant in this scenario. Certain species of bacteria can produce hydrogen gas from organic waste, and that hydrogen can be used as a fuel source, or, combined with carbon dioxide, can be converted into methane through another biological process. The microbial world, which we tend to think of primarily as a threat, as the source of diseases and contamination, becomes a critical ally in the post-sun survival scenario. Microbes that can survive on chemical energy rather than light energy, that can convert waste streams into useful products, that can process materials that human digestive systems cannot. These organisms become, in a very real sense, partners in survival rather than threats to it. The insects as food question, which has been discussed in sustainability circles for years as a response to the environmental cost of conventional animal agriculture, becomes suddenly urgent and practical. Insects, particularly mealworms, black soldier fly larvae, and crickets, can be farmed in complete darkness, on organic waste material at extraordinarily high density, producing protein and fat at efficiencies that dwarf conventional livestock. They require minimal space, minimal water, and no light. A properly managed insect farming operation in a basement or mine shaft can produce substantial quantities of protein from waste streams that would otherwise be useless. The cultural barriers to entomophagy, the human reluctance to eat insects, which is cultural rather than biological and varies enormously across different cultures, become less relevant when the alternative is starvation. The role of chemistry in post-sun food production is significant. The Fischer-Tropsch process, which converts carbon monoxide and hydrogen into liquid hydrocarbons, can produce a range of organic chemicals from which some nutrients can be synthesized. More directly relevant is the synthesis of key nutrients, vitamins, particularly vitamin D, normally produced in the skin by ultraviolet radiation, which is no longer available, vitamin A, and certain B vitamins, which would need to be produced chemically or through fermentation in a world without sunlight. The industrial chemistry knowledge base for doing this exists. The challenge is scaling it and making it accessible to the population who needs it. Water production becomes a critical engineering challenge as natural freshwater systems fail. The water cycle, which has been replenishing aquifers and rivers through precipitation for billions of years, has stopped. The aquifers will drain over time as water is used, but not replenished. Rivers, which are fed by precipitation and snowmelt, will eventually stop flowing as their sources disappear. The ocean remains a vast reservoir of water, but it is saline and increasingly covered in ice, making extraction increasingly difficult. Desalination, the removal of salt from seawater to produce fresh water, requires significant energy, but is technically well understood and is already practiced at scale in dry regions around the world. In a world with nuclear and geothermal electricity, desalination becomes a critical technology, and facilities close to the coast with access to ocean water and sufficient electricity can produce fresh water essentially indefinitely. The energy question is ultimately the central one, and it's worth spending a moment on the numbers to understand what's actually possible. As of the time of writing, the world has about 440 nuclear reactors, producing about 10% of the world's electricity. In the post-sun world, this fraction would need to grow dramatically to replace the energy currently provided by solar and fossil fuels. The theoretical resource base for nuclear energy, primarily uranium and thorium, both of which are relatively abundant elements in Earth's crust, is sufficient to power human civilization at its current energy consumption level for thousands of years. The challenge is not resource availability, it's the industrial infrastructure required to mine, refine, and fabricate nuclear fuel, and the engineering required to build and maintain reactors. In the post-sun world, the most valuable human beings on the planet, more valuable than any political leader, more valuable than any billionaire, more valuable than any celebrity, are the nuclear engineers, the geothermal engineers, and the agricultural scientists who understand how to grow food without sunlight. Their knowledge is the difference between civilization and extinction, and the societies that protect and empower them will survive longest. The psychological dimensions of survival are perhaps as challenging as the physical ones. Human beings are adapted to the rhythms of a sunlit world. Our circadian biology is tuned to the 24-hour cycle of day and night. Our psychology is deeply connected to natural light, to the outdoors, to the experience of weather and seasons. Extended confinement in underground or heavily insulated facilities, under artificial lighting, separated from the natural world. These conditions are profoundly stressful to human psychology, as every study of Antarctic winter stations, submarine deployments, and isolation experiments has shown. The communities that survive best in this scenario would be those with the strongest social bonds, the clearest sense of shared purpose, the most equitable resource distribution, and the most thoughtfully designed physical environments, places where art and music and human connection are prioritized alongside engineering and food production. Purely utilitarian survival communities, focused only on the physical prerequisites of existence, will find that the human spirit requires more than physical sustenance, and that communities which fail to provide meaning and beauty will fracture along the same lines that all confined, stressed, resource-limited communities have fractured throughout history. The question of who gets to be in these survival communities is the darkest and most important political question of the post-sun world. The decision of which populations have access to geothermal resources, nuclear facilities, and the engineering expertise to build and maintain survival infrastructure is, effectively, the decision of which portions of humanity continue. This decision would be made partly by geography. Iceland's geothermal resources are fixed in space, and the people near them benefit, and partly by the pre-existing inequalities of human civilization. Who has access to technology? Who has political power? Who has the resources to prepare? The post-sun world, if any human civilization survives for centuries, would be radically different from anything that preceded it. It would be a civilization of enclosed spaces, of artificial light, of carefully managed ecosystems and precisely calculated resource budgets. It would have no agriculture in the traditional sense, no outdoor spaces, no concept of weather or seasons, no day and night beyond what is artificially imposed. Children born into this world would have no direct experience of wind on their face, rain on their skin, or the sound of birds in open air. The sky, that vast and previously taken for granted expanse of blue, the backdrop against which every human civilization has told its stories about the cosmos, would be gone, replaced by rock and ice, glimpsed only through the portals of heavily insulated observation chambers. Let's address the most obvious scientific question head-on. Could the sun actually disappear? And if it can't vanish the way we've been describing, what are the real mechanisms by which a star like our sun could effectively cease to provide energy to its planets? The short and important answer is that the specific scenario we've been exploring, the sudden, instantaneous, complete disappearance of the sun, is not physically possible within the framework of known physics. Stars don't do that. The sun is a ball of hydrogen and helium held together by its own gravity and radiating energy through nuclear fusion in its core. For it to simply cease to exist, you would need to violate several fundamental conservation laws: conservation of energy, conservation of mass, conservation of momentum, so simultaneously and completely. This is the definition of physically impossible, but the sun can and will change, and the timeline and mechanisms of that change are well understood by astrophysicists. The sun is currently in the middle of its main sequence life, roughly 4.6 billion years old, with approximately 5 billion years of hydrogen burning left before the internal dynamics begin to shift. In that remaining 5 billion years, several things will happen, none of them instantaneous, and most of them not conducive to life on Earth. In approximately 1 billion years, a time frame so long it almost defies comprehension, but which is still firmly within the lifespan of the Earth, the Sun will have brightened enough to begin boiling away Earth's oceans. This is not the catastrophic sudden event we've been discussing. It is a gradual process of atmospheric water vapor increasing, a runaway greenhouse effect developing, and the surface temperature climbing beyond the boiling point of water. Earth will become Venus. This is the actual fate of the Earth on a billion-year timescale, and it is the opposite of the scenario we've been exploring. Not the removal of solar energy, but the overwhelming excess of it. On the 5 billion-year timescale, the Sun will exhaust the hydrogen in its core and begin burning hydrogen in a shell around the core, which causes the outer layers of the Sun to expand dramatically. The Sun will become a red giant, swelling outward from its current radius of about 696,000 kilometers to perhaps 200 times that, roughly 139 million kilometers, which would place the surface of the red giant Sun close to, or possibly slightly inside, Earth's current orbital radius. The fate of Earth in this scenario is uncertain. Models suggest it might be engulfed. Though the Sun loses so much mass during its red giant phase, mass loss carries angular momentum which widens orbital radii, that Earth might spiral outward fast enough to avoid being swallowed. What is certain is that by the red giant phase, Earth's surface will have been sterile for hundreds of millions of years already. But what about scenarios where a star becomes suddenly much less luminous? There are real astrophysical events that can dramatically reduce the output of a star, and while they don't describe disappearance in the absolute sense we've been using, they are worth knowing about. One is the concept of a sudden darkening through circumstellar material, a cloud of dust or gas that passes between a star and its planets. Tabby's star, formerly known as KIC 8462852, became famous in 2015 when astronomers noticed it dimming by up to 22% at irregular intervals, far more than any planetary transit could explain. While the ultimate cause was found to be consistent with circumstellar dust, rather than any exotic scenario, Tabby's star demonstrated that stars can experience dramatic, unusual dimming events that wouldn't be easily predictable. A particularly dense dust cloud orbiting a star could, in principle, reduce the light reaching an inner planet by enormous amounts for extended periods. More dramatic is the concept of a stellar flare or catastrophic event that could suddenly alter a star's energy output in the downward direction. Stars are not perfectly stable. They experience cycles of activity, and some types of variable stars fluctuate dramatically. The Sun itself has an 11-year cycle, during which its energy output varies by about 0.1%, small enough to barely register but real and measurable. Some stars vary by much more. Cepheid variables, for instance, expand and contract regularly, changing their luminosity by factors of 2 to 10 over periods of days to months. If a planet happened to orbit a Cepheid variable, its surface temperature would swing dramatically with each cycle. More relevant to our scenario is the phenomenon of stellar collapse. Massive stars, though significantly heavier than our Sun, end their lives in supernovae, cataclysmic explosions visible across galaxies that can briefly outshine the entire galaxy they reside in. The core of the exploding star collapses either into a neutron star or a black hole, depending on its mass. From the perspective of any planets that might have been orbiting the star, the event is not a disappearance. It is an extinction by energy, the planets being bathed in lethal radiation before any cooling can occur. But there is a subset of very massive stars that may collapse directly into a black hole without a supernova, a silent collapse in which the star simply, almost instantaneously, is gone, replaced by a black hole of the same mass. Astronomers have observed candidates for this process, stars that disappeared from view without an obvious supernova signature. Our Sun, being a relatively low-mass star, will not undergo this fate. It will not collapse silently into a black hole. But in the universe at large, planets orbiting massive stars may experience something closer to our thought experiment than most astronomical events allow for. The scientific value of our thought experiment, the sudden disappearance of the Sun, is not that it represents a plausible physical scenario, but that it illuminates, with unusual clarity, the precise contributions that the Sun makes to Earth's habitability. Every stage of our exploration has revealed a new layer of solar dependency. The light for photosynthesis, the heat for liquid water, the gravity for orbital stability, the solar wind for the heliosphere, the UV radiation for vitamin D synthesis. The Sun is not simply important to Earth's life, It is so deeply interwoven with every biological and physical system on this planet that separating it is like trying to remove the colour blue from a painting without touching any of the other colours. You can't. It is everywhere. There is something that has been sitting quietly at the edge of everything we've discussed, waiting for us to look directly at it, and I want to spend some time there now. Because the story of the sun's disappearance is not just a physics problem or a survival challenge, it is something more profound than that. It is a mirror. Consider again those 8 minutes and 20 seconds, the gap between the event and the experience of the event. For that window of time, the sun does not exist, and yet we are bathed in its light. We are warm from its heat. The woman hanging laundry in the Midwest is squinting against its brightness. The teenagers are taking photographs against its blue sky. The farmer in Vietnam is adjusting his hat against its glare. All of this is real. All of this is happening. And yet the source of it all has been gone for 8 minutes. Here is something even more profound about that gap that we haven't yet fully examined. It is not unique to this scenario. This is the permanent condition of observation in the universe. The light that reaches your eyes from the nearest star, Proxima Centauri, left that star 4.2 years ago. What you see when you look at Proxima Centauri is not Proxima Centauri as it is. It is Proxima Centauri as it was 4.2 years ago, a ghost image crossing the void. The Andromeda Galaxy, the nearest large galaxy to our own, is visible on a dark night as a faint smudge, and what you're seeing is light that left Andromeda 2.5 million years ago. The universe you're looking at is a museum of the past, its exhibits lit by light that departed its sources long before it arrived in your eyes. The oldest light we can detect, the cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint afterglow of the Big Bang, left its source 13.8 billion years ago. When we observe it, we are looking back in time to when the universe was a mere 380,000 years old. The 8 minutes and 20 seconds is simply the smallest and most personal instance of this universal truth. You cannot observe the present. You can only observe the past. Every observation is a memory. The question is, how old? This is something physics students learn in the first weeks of optics and relativity courses, and it is one of those facts that tends to be intellectually accepted and then immediately forgotten, filed away as a curiosity that doesn't have much bearing on daily life. The disappearance scenario is a way of feeling it rather than just knowing it, of having the intellectual fact land with emotional weight. The light is a message from the past. It always was. Even on a normal Tuesday, the sunlight on your face is 8 minutes old, a signal sent by a star that existed 500 seconds ago. We are never seeing the sun as it is now. We are always seeing it as it was. The universe's speed limit, the invariant speed of a light, ensures that every observation we make of anything beyond our immediate vicinity is an observation of the past. And the further away the thing is, the older the image. The stars we see on a clear night are not the stars as they are. They are the stars as they were, their light carrying information about their state from years to thousands to millions of years ago. Some of the stars we see are already dead. Their light is a ghost, still travelling, still arriving, long after the source has changed or ceased. This is true always. This is not a feature of the disappearance scenario. This is the nature of observation in a universe where information travels at a finite speed. But the disappearance scenario makes it viscerally, uncomfortably real in a way that normal sunbathing does not. Because normally we take the continuity of the sun as a given. We assume that the sun that existed 8 minutes ago is essentially identical to the sun that exists now, and this assumption has been valid for 4.5 billion years. The thought experiment ruptures this assumption cleanly, and in doing so it asks a question about the nature of certainty. There is no way right now to know for certain that the sun exists. We can measure the light arriving at Earth and confirm that photons with solar characteristics are reaching us, and from this we infer that the sun existed 8 minutes ago. But the universe has not promised us that this situation will persist. The universe owes us nothing. The processes that maintain the sun, the gravitational pressure balancing the radiation pressure, the hydrogen supply in the core available for fusion, these processes have been stable for 4.5 billion years, and on the current best models they will continue for another 5 billion, but that is a prediction based on physics and not a guarantee from the cosmos. The universe has produced stranger things than a star going dark. This is not something to be anxious about. The sun is not going anywhere on any timescale relevant to human civilization, and understanding the physics makes this clear. But the thought experiment invites a kind of philosophical humility. Everything we experience is contingent on systems so vast and so deep and so fundamental that we spend most of our lives not thinking about them at all. The sun is the most obvious example, but it is not the only one. The Earth's magnetic field, generated by convection in the liquid iron core, shields us from solar radiation and cosmic rays that would sterilize the surface. The moon's gravitational influence stabilizes Earth's axial tilt, preventing the dramatic climate swings that would occur if the tilt varied chaotically as it does on Mars. The particular distance of Earth from the sun, which maintains liquid water on the surface, the particular mass of the sun, which produces the right spectrum of light for photosynthesis. Jupiter's gravitational influence, which deflects many potential impactors away from the inner solar system. These are all things we have not arranged. They existed before us, and we evolved within them, and we take them as the default condition of existence. The disappearance of the sun is, philosophically, an invitation to see the default conditions clearly, to recognize the astronomical luck embedded in every moment of ordinary existence, and to feel something in response to that recognition. And there is a particular quality to the recognition that comes from this thought experiment that is different from simpler statements of the same fact. The sun is important for life is something you can hear and immediately agree with and immediately forget, because it doesn't feel like information about your Tuesday afternoon. It feels like a fact about biology or astronomy that belongs in a textbook. But imagining the sun gone, imagining the sky going dark mid-afternoon, imagining the food chain beginning to collapse, imagining Earth sailing away from its orbit at 107,000 kilometers per hour, this is not something you can immediately agree with and immediately forget. It lands differently. It puts the sun in a frame of contrast that its constant presence normally prevents. The philosopher William James wrote about the experience of realizing things as if for the first time. The particular quality of perception that arises when something familiar suddenly becomes strange, when the habitual filters of the mind are removed and the actual character of something can be seen directly. He was describing religious and mystical experiences, but the phenomenon extends beyond those contexts. It is the feeling of returning home after a long absence and seeing your own living room with the eyes of a visitor. It is the feeling of hearing a piece of music you know so well that you've stopped actually listening to it, and then one day truly hearing it again. It is the feeling of looking at your own hands, these things that have been at the ends of your arms your entire life, and actually seeing them. The disappearance scenario does something like this for the sun. It gives you a moment of seeing the sun as if for the first time, with the filters of familiarity removed. And what you see, when you look at it clearly, is not something you can reduce to its practical benefits or its physical properties. What you see is the thing itself, in its full strangeness and magnitude. A star. Your star. The star that made you possible in the most fundamental biological and physical sense. Still there. Still sending. The light still travelling. What you feel in response is, I suppose, a personal matter. Some people feel gratitude. Some feel awe. Some feel a kind of vertiginous smallness. The sensation of standing on the edge of something vast and realizing how narrow the path is. All of these seem like appropriate responses to me. What I find most striking about the 8-minute window is not the darkness that follows it, but the extraordinary ordinary beauty that exists within it. Those final 500 seconds of unknowing light. The world going about its business in the warmth of a star that has already stopped. The photons completing their 93 million mile journey to a destination whose inhabitants have not yet received the news. There is something in that image that feels important. The persistence of the light after the source is gone. The way beauty outlasts the thing that made it, for a little while. Let's end by imagining forward. Past the immediate catastrophe, past the first year of desperate survival, past the compression of civilization into geothermal and nuclear refuges. Let's imagine 1,000 years after the disappearance and ask, what might be there? The question assumes that something survives, which is not guaranteed but is possible. The scenario that is most plausible, given the geography and physics we've described, involves something like the following. A collection of communities, perhaps numbering in the tens of millions rather than billions, settled primarily around Iceland's geothermal zone, certain Pacific volcanic regions, and wherever nuclear facilities have been maintained and expanded. These communities are underground in the sense that they are insulated from the exterior environment, warm inside their buildings and tunnels, while the surface is at temperatures incompatible with unprotected human life. They grow food under artificial lights, eat a diet heavily weighted toward fungal and bacterial sources, supplemented by artificial light vegetables, and carefully maintained aquaponic fish systems. They have maintained enough of the knowledge base of human civilization, through digital libraries, institutional education systems, and the living memory of successive generations, to continue doing physics, medicine, engineering, and art. Their relationship to the former world would be somewhat like our relationship to the deep past, mediated by records and stories rather than direct experience. No one alive has seen the sun. The concept of sunlight would be taught in schools from the historical record, like we teach children about the dinosaurs. The sun would be a fact of history, the most important fact of history, the precondition for everything that came before, rather than a feature of daily experience. What would these people value? What would they dream about? There is something to explore here about the preservation and transformation of human culture in the absence of the natural world that shaped it. Human art and music and poetry and religion are not created in a vacuum. They are created in response to experience, and the experiences that have most profoundly shaped human culture over our entire history are the experiences of the natural world. Sunrise and sunset, seasons, weather, the particular quality of afternoon light through leaves, the sound of wind, the smell of rain. These things are embedded so deeply in human culture and language and metaphor that their absence would create a rupture not just in daily life, but in the very language through which humans understand themselves and communicate with each other. 1,000 years into the post-sun era, the descendants of the survivors would have a different relationship to those concepts than we do. Some would be preserved with nearly religious reverence, maintained in the cultural record with extraordinary care, recordings of dawn light over a mountain, descriptions of the feeling of sun on skin, the particular vocabulary of weather that saturates every language on Earth. These would be sacred texts in a real sense, describing a world that no one currently alive has ever experienced. And from those preserved experiences, art would continue to emerge, not despite the darkness, but because of it. Human creativity does not require sunlight. It requires difficulty and aspiration, and the gap between what is and what is longed for. A civilization that has lost the sun has not lost the capacity for music or painting, or mathematics or love or humour, or any of the things that make human existence worth having. It has only changed the reference frame within which those things occur. There is also, in this long future scenario, the extraordinary possibility of deliberate discovery. A civilization that has 1,000 years of technological development ahead of it, even at greatly reduced capacity compared to pre-disappearance civilization, would be a civilization that continues to advance. Nuclear fusion power, which has always been 30 years away, but which is getting genuinely closer in the real world, would be a focus of intense development in a world that desperately needs energy sources. Advanced robotics and automation would be critical for doing the surface temperature work, mining, construction, maintenance of exterior infrastructure, that humans cannot safely do themselves. Medicine would advance, as it always does in populations under pressure. And here is the extraordinary thought. A civilization that has survived this catastrophe and continued developing technology for 1,000 years might in that time have begun developing the capacity to leave Earth entirely. Generation ships, which we explored in a separate video, become a more urgent project when the home planet is a frozen rock headed into the void. The same geothermal and nuclear energy that sustains the underground civilization could, if directed toward propulsion research, power the development of the propulsion systems needed to leave the solar system and head toward another star. Earth, as a rogue planet, would never reach another star on any timescale relevant to civilization, tens of thousands of years at minimum. But a spacecraft launched from Earth, using the most advanced propulsion systems that 1,000 years of continued technological development might produce, could potentially reach the nearest star systems in a fraction of that time. The people of the underground civilization, born on a sunless world, might become the architects of humanity's first intentional interstellar mission. The catastrophe that took away their sun might be the event that ultimately sent humanity to the stars. There is something genuinely moving about that possibility. Not because it makes the catastrophe acceptable. Nothing makes an extinction-scale event acceptable. But because it illustrates something real and important about the relationship between adversity and possibility. The worst thing and the most extraordinary thing can sometimes come from the same source. The extinction of the dinosaurs, after all, opened the ecological space that allowed small, nocturnal, warm-blooded mammals to diversify into every niche on Earth. One of those mammals, 66 million years later, is sitting in front of a screen and thinking about the sun. The sun is still there. Let me say that clearly, because we've spent a lot of time in this video in a world where it isn't, and it seems worth coming back to the real world for a moment. The sun is still there. Right now, at this moment, it is doing what it has been doing for 4.6 billion years, fusing hydrogen into helium in its core at a rate of roughly 620 million tons of hydrogen per second, converting a fraction of that mass into pure energy according to Einstein's most famous equation, and radiating that energy outward in all directions. Some of those photons, 8 minutes and 20 seconds after being emitted, are warming your face if you're outdoors. Some of them are falling on the leaves of the plants that produce the oxygen you're breathing. Some of them are driving the water cycle that filled the glass of water you might have nearby. The sun has approximately 5 billion years of hydrogen fuel remaining. On that scale, the question of our civilization, of our species, of the entire history of life on Earth is barely a footnote. We are an extraordinarily recent event on a star that was already middle-aged by the time life began to get interesting here. But knowing that doesn't make the 8 minutes and 20 seconds any less interesting. Because the thought experiment we've spent this video exploring is not really about the sun. It's about the relationship between certainty and awareness, about how much we take for granted in each moment of ordinary existence, about how the most important things, the things without which nothing else is possible, are often the least visible precisely because they are so constant and so complete. Think about what we actually discovered by removing the sun. Not just that it's important in the vague poster on a classroom wall sense. We discovered that it is load-bearing for everything. Photosynthesis stops in an instant, taking with it the base of every terrestrial food chain. The temperature, which humanity spent most of its history assuming was simply the temperature of the world, begins falling at 20 degrees Celsius per day. The gravitational tether that has guided Earth through 4.5 billion years of reliable orbital motion snaps, and a planet whose entire biology evolved under the assumption of a stable solar orbit suddenly becomes an interstellar wanderer. The heliosphere, the invisible magnetic bubble that has been protecting our solar system from the full intensity of the galaxy's cosmic radiation for the entire history of life on Earth, begins to collapse. The water cycle, the mechanism by which the ocean evaporates into the sky and returns as rain on mountains and farms and forests, goes quiet. The sun is not one thing. It is everything. It is the heat and the light and the gravity and the shield and the cycle and the engine. We don't have a word in any language for everything that makes life possible, but if we did, that word would be a synonym for star. The thought experiment also, inevitably, raises questions about what we do with the time we have. The sun is not going to disappear on any timescale relevant to our species, not for billions of years. But the habit of taking it for granted, the habit of moving through ordinary Tuesdays without any awareness of the extraordinary physical machinery sustaining them, that habit doesn't require an actual catastrophe to be worth examining. You don't need the sun to actually disappear to ask yourself what it means that you have never really looked at it. There's a practice in philosophy called negative visualization, the deliberate contemplative act of imagining the absence of something you value, not to induce anxiety, but to restore a sense of genuine appreciation for what you have. The ancient Stoics practiced it. They would sit with the thought of losing the things they loved, health, relationships, freedom, the ordinary pleasures of a day, and find that the imagination of loss clarified the reality of having. You value water most in a desert. You appreciate silence most when you've spent time in noise. The 8 minutes and 20 seconds is, in a sense, the most elaborate and physically accurate negative visualization exercise ever conceived. The sun disappears not in imagination but in physics, and in the gap between its disappearance and our knowledge of that disappearance. We get to sit with those last photons and understand for a moment what they actually are. They are not just light, they are the proof that a star loves you. Well, that's romantic language, and stars don't love anything, they are balls of plasma. But they are the physical evidence that a nuclear furnace 93 million miles away has been sending energy in your direction for your entire life, and for the entire lives of every ancestor you have ever had, and for the entire 3.8 billion years of life on Earth before them. Every calorie you have ever consumed came, ultimately, from a photon that made this journey. Every breath you have ever taken was made possible by photons that powered the photosynthesis that produced the oxygen. Every warm day, every growing season, every ocean current that shaped the climate that shaped the civilization that built the city you live in, all of it cascading forward from that original gift of 8 minutes and 20 seconds. I find that genuinely moving. The fact that the light travelling between a star and a planet doesn't know whether it will arrive to a world that is paying attention or a world that isn't. The photons travel regardless. The warmth lands on your face regardless. The question of whether you are paying attention, that's on you. The universe is running an experiment right now, at this exact moment, on whether any species of sufficient intelligence will look up from its immediate concerns long enough to understand what it is embedded in. To see not just the practical gifts of starlight, but the philosophical ones. The evidence of scale, of contingency, of the extraordinary narrowness of the conditions that make a Tuesday afternoon possible. I think about the people who would be born on the sunless Earth 1,000 years hence in underground settlements around Icelandic geothermal vents. I think about what they would be taught about the sun. Not a given, not an assumption, not the background radiation of existence, but a historical fact, a thing that was, a thing that made the world, that made the people who made them. I think about what they would feel, hearing those descriptions, what it would mean to them to learn that once, for billions of years, a star provided everything for free. No charge, no maintenance required, just an inexhaustible outpouring of energy that life learned to use. What it would mean to live in a world where that is history instead of present tense. I hope they would feel something like what I feel when I really think about it. Something that doesn't have a clean name, a mixture of gratitude and awe, and the particular kind of alertness that comes from recognizing something precious. The word I reach for most often is wonder, the word that names the feeling of encountering something real and vast and genuinely important, and realizing you have been standing next to it your whole life without quite seeing it. The sun is still there. It rose this morning, or it will rise tomorrow morning, and it will be the same act it has performed 1.6 trillion times since the Earth formed. A slow arc across the sky, a warm presence, a light so ordinary we forget to see it. And in that morning light, 8 minutes and 20 seconds old, there is everything we've been talking about. The physics and the philosophy and the food chains and the gravity, and the 4.5 billion year story of a planet and its star, arriving on your skin at 299,792 kilometers per second, asking whether you're paying attention. The universe is vast and beautiful and strange, and we're just getting started understanding it. And if this video made you look at the sky differently, even for a moment, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below, share what you're thinking, and if you found yourself genuinely gripped by the physics and the philosophy here, consider subscribing to the Cosmic Pup. We explore these questions every week, the big ones, the ones that don't have easy answers but are absolutely worth asking. Every video is a chance to see something familiar from a completely unfamiliar angle, and that, I think, is one of the best things science can do for us. Like the video if you want more of this, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And until the next one, go outside if you can. Look up, feel the warmth on your face. It left the sun 8 minutes ago. It crossed 150 million kilometers of empty space to get to you. That's not nothing. That's everything. See you later, guys.